here to listen to David Harvey. I'm not going to spend long in praise of David, although one could spend long in praise of him, particularly through his very innovative work integrating space into Marxism. Arguably, he's helped to reinvent Marxism over the past generation. People sometimes call Marxism these days geo-historical materialism. Thanks to his innovations and suggestions. And one might say it's surprising that David didn't get the prize earlier, for example, for his great book, The Limits to Capital, published in 1982. We had a really good session in the Historical Materialism Conference just before this lecture. Recently, David has won an extraordinarily large audience for Marxist ideas and Marxist criticism through his video lectures online on Marxist Capital. But he's also very much continuing both to apply and to extend historical materialism as an intellectual tradition, and that's reflected in the book that received the prize for 2010, The Enigma of Capital and the Crises of Capitalism. Incidentally, publishers plug, both The Limits to Capital and The Enigma of Capital are there, and you can buy them at the end if you don't. If through some terrible mistake you don't have them. And this body of work is a very important reference point in the Marxist response to a crisis of capitalism which, to an certain extent, exceeds our wildest imaginings in our most catastrophist moments, and which seems never to be ending. So, David's lecture tonight continues his engagement with capital. It's called History versus Theory, a commentary on Marx's method in Capital. Sorry, I hesitated because my handwriting is so bad. Anyway, enough of me and over to David.
First, I want to thank the committee for awarding me this prize. It's a great pleasure, a great honour to be awarded this, and it's a great pleasure to have so many people here who want to hear my rambling thoughts on what goes on in Marx's Capital. Now, this may seem to be a very funny moment to be talking about this. The whole world is sort of falling apart. The euro is about to collapse. The bourgeoisie plainly has no idea what to do, seems to be totally lost for solutions to the dilemmas in which it finds itself. Movements are bubbling up all over the world. Some have been long-standing. One thinks of the landless peasant movement in Brazil, and many of the movements in India and so on. But now they're added to by the movements of the indignados, by the movements around Wall Street and here in London. And in other parts of the world there are some very significant struggles going on. I had the privilege about 3 weeks ago to be in Chile for a week. There was an astonishing struggle going on there, and I would just like to mention this by way of introduction, because when Pinochet was displaced by democratization, there's a whole area in Santiago, which is various barrios which say basically nothing changed. And we've seen that happen again and again. We got rid of Margaret Thatcher, and what did we get? We got Tony Blair. We see the Egyptian revolution, they got rid of Mubarak, and what's really changing? Even something like apartheid in Africa, which seemed like a world-changing shift. For many people in that country, they look around and say, what has really changed? And I think what this suggests is that in the Chilean case there's a clear understanding that what has to be rolled back is 30, 40 years of neoliberal kind of colonization. Colonization not only in terms of the economy, but colonization in terms of thought processes, mental conceptions of the world, technology, and all the rest of it. Revolution is not a moment, it is a process. And one of the theses that I tried to lay out a bit in The Enigma of Capital is to look at it as a long-term process where there are a number of dimensions, moments, if you want to be sort of more technical in Marxist terms, which have to change simultaneously for the revolution really to stick and really make a difference. And Margaret Thatcher was not only concerned to change the economy and various other institutional arrangements, she set out to change the way in which we understood the world and we understood ourselves in it. Which she said, basically, I'm out to change people's souls. And to the degree that she succeeded, we still live with Thatcherism. We are still in the midst of Thatcherism. In the same way in Chile, they still live with the whole kind of ethic that Pinochet dictated and implanted. So this is, if you like, a long-term push. And one of the arguments I would make is that transformations have to occur across all of these different dimensions of technologies, relations to nature, production systems, social institutions, and the like. But one of the dimensions which is crucial are what Marx called mental conceptions of the world. And what we really require now is a radical transformation of mental conceptions. Now, I'm under no illusion that simply changing mental conceptions changes the world. It doesn't. But on the other hand, you can't change the world without changing mental conceptions. So this is a piece of the puzzle. And with the total bankruptcy of bourgeois ideas right now, and living with a university system that is basically completely colonized by the neoliberal ethic and by corporatist, managerial, technocratic kind of understandings of the world, we're desperately in need of new ways of thinking and finding new ways of thinking. And it seems to me one of the movements that is now occurring is to say, let's look for those new ways of thinking. Now, immediately, of course, when something like that occurs, somebody rushes in and says, hey, I've got it, here's mine, I've been around for a long time, take mine. We are at a different moment, I think, where all kind of forms of thinking need to be brought together and considered and opened up and really reconfigured. And that includes Marxism, which I've been involved in for many years. But of course, at moments like this, dissident thinkers do indeed come back into play, and people kind of say, well, it's so bankrupt in everything that I see being taught around, maybe this guy had something to say. Maybe it's a leading anarchist figure, somebody like Murray Bookchin or whoever, or maybe it's Marx or whoever it is. And as somebody who has been teaching Marx for a very long time, I feel a very acute obligation right now to try to teach Marx in a way that people can understand. There are lots of elaborations of Marx that make Marx even more complicated than he already is. And I think that actually right now what we need is some simplifications, if we can possibly come up with some simplifications, which would actually give a clearer perspective of what it is that Marx is trying to do and how he is doing it. And part of the objective of putting the Marx's Capital Volume 1 online was to try to do that, and of course then write a companion version. Actually last semester we filmed Volume 2, and that is now currently being edited, and I imagine in the next few weeks they will start to put the Volume 2 lectures online, which have a similar format to the Volume 1, and I'm working on a companion to Volume 2. But one of the things I did with the Volume 2 lectures was a little experiment, because Volume 2 I think is extremely important. I had never really kind of taught it as a book before, but as a book it's god-awful. It really is. It's boring. And the poor translator actually said, look, he said, he was obviously feeling that everybody was going to blame him for what's in the text. And he kind of said, you know, I've done the best I can, but you know, this this volume is legendary for the deserts you have to go through to uncover a few oases. And so I'm stuck with the kind of thing of trying to make this thing entertaining when it's boring, to try to make it interesting and to try to draw out some of its fundamental underlying configurations. But in the process, a whole set of questions that I'd always had about Volume 1 but never really kind of wanted to answer came up. But they came up big time, and I had to find some answer to them. And that is mainly what I'm going to be talking about tonight. But in order to make Volume 2 a little bit more interesting, what I did was I thought, well, you know, Marx begins by distinguishing between these three circuits of capital, which are really talked about in very technocratic kind of terms. There's a money circuit, a commodity circuit, and a productive circuit. And the whole lot put together is called the circuit of industrial capital. And like I say, it's all very boring. And I thought to myself, well, what would happen if I said, well, the commodity circuit connects to merchants, so why don't we take all of the stuff in Volume 3 about merchants' capital and stick it right in the back of all this stuff in Volume 2 and see what happens. And why don't we do the same, by the way, with money capital and take all the stuff on finance in Volume 3 and put it in Volume 2 and see what happens. Well, this was a very neat way, of course, of making Volume 2 much more relevant, because by the time you go through all the stuff about, you know, finance capital and fictitious capital and all of that in Volume 3, you start to see what the relevance is of the technocratic kind of way in which Marx has set it up in Volume 2. But then that poses some other questions as to why didn't he do that? Why didn't he tell us in Volume 2, hey, go and look at this stuff if you really want to look at the agents who are doing this, and look at the crazy things they get up to, and all of the speculative stuff that goes on around these circuits. Why didn't you tell us to go look at all of that? And so there's some interesting kind of questions of that sort, which connects also to another set of issues. On the first page of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx says, he introduces the notion of commodity, and he then talks about use values. And he says, well, use values is all very interesting, but frankly, to study the uses of things is the work of history. And immediately this suggests that Marx has in mind that there are two distinctive fields of inquiry. One is history, and the other is political economy. And this isn't an isolated comment. You'll find it elsewhere, you'll find it in the Grundrisse and everywhere else. So Marx is setting up something where he's saying that political economy and history are two separate fields. And of course, this has been registered in the Marxist tradition in the following sense, that many people who read the political economic writings and, you know, theories of surplus value and capital and Grundrisse and so on, see a clear distinction between that and the more political historical writings like the 18th Brumaire and class struggles in France. And the two kinds of literatures don't fit together very well. Now, it's not as if there's no mention of history, particularly in Volume 1 of Capital, although you have a hard time finding much of it in Volume 2. It's there, and of course the notion of the historical, capitalist mode of production is always understood as a historical construct of some kind, and that therefore it is itself historical. But Marx is writing about it in Capital in a certain kind of way, which evades a lot of its actual historical transformations and the like. To look at those, we go look at the 18th Brumaire and try to say something about, you know, but then when you get to the 18th Brumaire and you kind of say, well, where's the theory of relative surplus value in here? Where's the theory of the foreign rate of profit? And you do that with class struggles in France, and there's no mention of any of that. There's no mention of any of the conceptual apparatus that exists in the political economy in those historical writings. And this always struck me as kind of weird. And then there's something that goes with that, that is that there tends to come out of the political economy a notion that there is a law-like determinacy of the way in which capital works. The iron laws of motion of capital, they're very fixed and very, very, you know, so it's almost a deterministic kind of sense. Whereas when you're reading about how that clown Louis Bonaparte became emperor, you realize this is all accidental and contingent and voluntaristic and all the rest of it. So out of this comes the notion of, well, what's the relationship between this kind of one way of understanding the world, which comes out of the political economy, and the other way of understanding it that comes out of the 18th Brumaire? What's the relationship between the two? And I've always been sort of fascinated by that, and and fascinated by Marx's engagement with all of that. And of course, in my own engagement with capital, I was never actually interested in capital per se. And I was never very interested in its scholarly kind of origins or its intellectual kind of origins. What I was really interested in all along was urbanization and uneven geographical development at a variety of scales. That's what I was interested in understanding. And the question I would then kind of want to say is, well, how does Marx help me understand all of that? And reading volume 1 of Capital wasn't actually terribly helpful. The helpful stuff came when I got to the theories of rent and the theories of things like, finance capital. I mean, to try to understand urbanization without understanding rent and without understanding finance was not. Now, in the renditions of Marx, which I encountered in the early 70s and into the 80s, there was hardly any discussion of those other aspects, which is why in the Minutes to Capital, as was mentioned this afternoon, I took the rather innovative step of saying, hey, finance capital is terribly important. And what's going on in fictitious capital formulation, and I love the fact that, of course, one of the figures who comes out in the history of finance capital and is Isaac Pereire, who's one of the bankers in Second Empire Paris, who had a tremendous role to play in the transformation of Paris in the Second Empire. And Marx kind of says of him, he says, he has the engaging character of swindler and prophet. And I was loving this stuff and saying, well, this is where the real stuff is. It's not in all that kind of stuff about falling rates of profit and all the rest of it. I can really engage with all of this. So there's something in capital that's there, but then it has to be actually brought to bear on all of this. And then it's really as a practitioner who's looking for understanding those kinds of questions that I was really kind of working through what capital was about. And it's from that perspective that I therefore want to offer some readings, not reading so much as a bit of an interpretation of what's going on in Marx's Capital and why it's going on in the way it's going on. And I think this is terribly important to suggest at this time, because people are likely to get back into the one-liners out of Marx, like all history is the history of class struggle, or the single most important source of crises under the history of capitalism is the restricted consumption of working class, or the famous statement about the falling rate of profit being the single most important law. Those one-liners, forget them. They're all embedded in something else that's going on. It's something else I really want to talk about. Now, what struck me, however, was certain tactics that Marx was adopting in Capital in Volume 1, which had always bothered me, but I never really sort of mentioned them because I thought students would get too confused if I did. But in Volume 2 you can't avoid them, and so these are the tactics that I want to talk about. And Marx, as usual, it tells you somewhere or other what he's doing and how he's doing it. And there are many outlines of what he had in mind in Capital. And I want to just take up one of them, preparatory arguments that is made, and read to you a little bit what he says. In the introduction to the Grundrisse, which was the critique of political economy, Marx talks about the relationships between production, distribution, consumption, exchange, and all the rest of it. And what he does is he gives a summary of how bourgeois economic theory treats of these categories. And he puts it as follows. He says, production appears as the point of departure, consumption as the conclusion, distribution and exchange as the middle. Production, distribution, exchange, and consumption form a regular syllogism. Production is the generality. Distribution and exchange the particularity. And consumption the singularity, in which the whole is joined together. This is, he then says, admittedly a coherence, but a shallow one. Production is determined by the general natural laws. I'm going to put natural in quotes here. Distribution by social accident and the latter may therefore promote production to a greater or lesser extent. Exchange stands between the two as a formal social movement, and the concluding act, consumption, which is conceived of not only as a terminal point, but also as an end in itself, actually belongs outside economics. Here we go again. That's not in the political economy. Outside economics, except insofar as it reacts in turn upon the point of departure and initiates the whole process anew. Now that is his description of how classical political economy understood the world. He then goes on in the next pages to sort of do his riff about, well, production is really consumption, and consumption, production, and relationalities, and all this kind of stuff, and everything relating to everything else. He does the same series of pages later about the relationship between distribution and production. And then he goes on to sort of talk about the relationalities and the dialectical integration of exchange relations and circulation and production. And he then comes to his conclusion. He says the conclusion we reach is not that production, distribution, exchange and consumption are identical. He's afraid of the Hegelian identity stuff and the Spinoza identity stuff. But that they all form the members of a totality, distinctions within a unity. Production predominates not only over itself in the antithetical definition of production, but over the other moments as well. Now what the hell does he mean by that, that production predominates not only over itself? It took me a little while to work that out, but then it's obvious. He's talking here about production of surplus value, and how production of surplus value dominates over the material processes of production. That's what he means. So the production here is not a material thing, it's a social thing that he's talking about. And it's the production of surplus value. And what is Volume 1 all about? It's the production of surplus value. And therefore it's the production of surplus value that is crucial, and it's the production of surplus value and the need to produce surplus value that dominates over the materiality and the material world of production. This actually counters what is often a physicalist reading of Marx, which kind of says that, oh, it's the physical material world which dominates over all else. No, production here is not a physical material world, it's a reproduction of the social relations. The process, he says, always returns to production to begin anew. That is, the reproduction of surplus value is the sine qua non of a capitalist society. That exchange and consumption cannot be predominant is self-evident. Likewise, distribution is distribution of products. While as distribution of the agents of production, it is itself a moment of production. A definite production thus determines a definite consumption, distribution and exchange, as well as definite relations between these different moments. Admittedly, however, in its one-sided form, production is itself determined by the other moments. This is typical Marx. Everything relates to everything else, and it's all kind of comes back. You know, everybody says, "Good God, how can you possibly understand that?" Mutual interaction takes place between the different moments. This is the case with every organic whole. Now, this is Marx talking about how he understands the world. Now, you would expect on this basis that he would then write a political economy that was cast in those terms. But the thesis I want to present to you is that the whole of capital, actually, is structured not around this conception at the end, but by the weak syllogism that he laid out at the very beginning. That is, whole of capital makes the assumption that there are these different levels. There is production, which is the level of generality. Production is law-like. Now, preceding that passage, I've read to you, there was another set of passages which suggests that there's another level, which is not the generality, it is the universality. And this is introduced in Capital as the metabolic relation to nature. So again and again in Capital we get this kind of commentary that the metabolic relation to nature is foundational, but this is not the specificity of what Capital is about. As he says, the relation to nature is common to all modes of production. And so we get this rejection of the consideration of the relation to nature as being foundational to capitalism in particular. It's foundational to human society, but it is not foundational to capitalism in particular. And what Marx wanted to do was to reject all explanations that suggested that what happened under capitalism occurred for quote, relation to nature reasons. Now, one of the reasons he really went after the falling rate of profit argument was, the falling rate of profit argument was very, very popular in classical political economy. But it was always attributed to natural scarcity, malthus. What Marx sought to do is to show if there was a falling rate of profit, it was due to the internal contradictions of capital, not to nature. That therefore you had to work at the level of generality to show why the profit rate was necessarily fall, not appeal to nature. And again and again and again he rejects naturalistic explanations, but he talks about the generality of capital as being law-like in its production, and he is out to look at its law-like characteristics. Now, his main source of information in all of this, and I think this is also very important to record, where did he get his ideas from? Where did he get his information from? He got it from classical political economy. Marx didn't go out and do historical inquiry. He didn't go out and do field work. He just read all of the classical political economists. And he read all of the information he could find on the day, you know, all the parliamentary reports and all the rest of it, and he read the press and all the rest of it. So his primary source of information was bourgeois information sources and the writings of classical political economists. And basically the position he takes is that, you know, for 200 years or more, there were a bunch of people around who were trying to make sense of the kind of society that was coming into being around them. And no matter whether they were being pure apologists for the accumulation of wealth or whether they were really genuinely trying to understand its dynamics, there was a good faith effort there to understand the nature of that society, and that therefore that was his raw material. Now this accords a great deal of authority and a great deal of significance to bourgeois thought. What Marx believed he could do was to take all of bourgeois thought and all of bourgeois information and through critical inquiry and critical method and dialectical method, convert it into another understanding of the world. Now whether you want to call that an alternative political economy or what, I don't know, but let's sake of argument say that was what he was about. But in so doing, he had to accept the terms that bourgeois political economy imposed. This is what he did in the second chapter of Volume 1 of Capital. He describes the market in purely Smithian terms. And it always takes people kind of say, he's talking about perfectly functioning markets. And people often are very uncomfortable about that. They say, well, perfectly functioning markets, how can he do that? Well, the answer is he's saying, look, there's a utopian vision that lies behind the writings of Adam Smith and all the rest of it, which says if only you create this kind of world, then everything will be great. And he says, okay, I'm going to imagine that that world is indeed a created according to the conditions you talked about, and instead of utopia, you're going to get dystopia. And what I'm going to prove to you is in your own terms that actually what you're going to get is an increasing disparity of wealth, more wealth at one scale, more impoverishment at the other scale. And of course, the closer you come back to all this free market ideology, that is exactly what has happened in capitalist societies over the last 30, 40 years. So this was Marx's tactic, was to actually accept the framework of classical political economy. Now this then creates some very, very peculiar things. For example, distribution does not get any coverage in capital at all, except in very marginal circumstances, until you get into volume 3. That is, he breezes through as if there is no splitting of the surplus value into interest on money capital, profit on production activities, profit on merchant capital, rent, taxes. None of that matters. The analysis proceeds as if those differentiations don't exist. And you kind of say, well, that's not a realistic conception of this society. That's not realistic at all. In fact, because distribution is a particularity and not part of the generality, he systematically excludes any consideration of distribution in his argument, except where he has to import it. For example, one of the big disappointments in Volume 1 of Capital, for me, maybe I hope for you, is that when it comes to the value of labour power, he spends 2 pages only. And he gives you a long list of things like the state of civilization in the country, the state of class struggle, the climate, you name it, it's all in there, kind of ragtag of everything. And then he kind of ends and says, well, value of labour power is affected by all these things, it's a moral determination, etc., so it's not a commodity like any other. But in a given society, at a given time, the datum is known, therefore we assume the datum is fixed, and we don't discuss it anymore until we get to the chapters on wages, in which case you imagine him, he's going to give you some really interesting insights into wage determination practices and processes. He doesn't do anything of the sort. He simply repeats the theory of relative surplus value for about the 5th time. And then he just does say, the only innovation is he says, oh, by the way, the capitalist could pay you in pieceworks or time, so per hour or per piece. And that gives them a different strategy. It's about the only innovation. And then there's a bit of an innovation about, well, what happens when the costs of labour power differ in different places, between different nations, and there's trade between nations. I mean, the section on wages in Volume 1 is rather pathetic. And you kind of go, well, why was that? Well, the answer is, it's about distribution, it's a particularity, and you don't want to deal with it. It's out of question. There are many issues of that kind that arise in Volume 1, but in Volume 2, boy, do you get it badly. Boy, do you get it. Again and again and again, about every 5th page, he says, of course, this all looks completely different when you introduce the credit system. He has a chapter on fixed capital, which, by the way, is much less interesting than the stuff he wrote about fixed capital in the Grundrisse. And it's a purely technocratic stuff. He doesn't even get into that odd kind of thing that he did mention in Volume 1, which is moral depreciation, i.e. the loss of value in fixed capital as new capital, innovation comes online. He doesn't even get into that very much, but he keeps on saying, and then he's into stuff about turnover times. So turnover times, people have to hoard capital because they have differential turnover times of the components they're using, and so you kind of say, well, if you had a credit system and you could lease forklift trucks and all that kind of thing, you wouldn't have any of these problems. And he says that. We wouldn't have any of these problems if we had the credit system, but I'm not prepared to deal with that here. I'm not prepared to deal with that here. This all looks different when the credit system is in there. And you kind of go, well, if credit is so important, and in fact, in some places in there, which is really very interesting, but I think this is an important point that he makes, is that he basically says, you can clearly see why the credit system is so necessary. You clearly see why. And in a sense, what Volume 2, if you read it in this light, what it will tell you is why we cannot do without a credit system. And then there are various other elements where it becomes clear that the credit system, when you actually integrate the Volume 3 stuff into it, you start to see something, very, very, very interesting. For instance, in Volume 2, he creates, well, I'll get round to this in a minute, because I need to put some. So, the distribution stuff is very badly handled. The stuff on rent, he kept on trying to absorb the notion of rent into the general laws of motion, but he can't do it. And he came up with a sort of crazy representation and idea of absolute rent, which I think really doesn't work very well. I never found it very persuasive. Differential rent, monopoly rent, I'm fine with, but absolute rent, I could never find any way to make it work in studies of Second Empire, Paris, or whatever. So the distribution side is left out because it's a particularity. He doesn't want to deal with it. This becomes even more strongly present when it comes to the whole kind of process of exchange, which is also understood as a particularity. And these particularities, and there are two which are very highly significant. The first is the notion of demand and supply. And the second is the notion of competition. Now, one of the first questions that comes up when teaching capital is, you get into it a little bit and then somebody says, well, what happened to demand and supply? Where'd it go? And you then give Marx's famous answer, which is, well, when demand and supply are in equilibrium, they don't explain anything. And, it's a pretty good reply. I mean, I kind of say, well, you know, because shoes cost twice as much as shirts, does that mean that shoes are demanded twice as much as shirts? No. What demand and supply will tell you is why, for instance, the price of shoes is fluctuating up and down, and the price of shirts is fluctuating up and down and all over the place, but it doesn't tell you. So Marx comes back when it's in equilibrium, yeah, and it's okay, it's not bad. It's not a bad idea. So you can get students past that and they say, oh, all right, okay. You go on, you know. But there are various points at which demand and supply are not in equilibrium. And there are a couple of moments where that occurs in Capital, Volume 1. For instance, the wage rate. Marx actually introduces the idea. The problem with the wage rate is this, that actually capital is in a position to operate on both the demand and the supply of capital at the same time. It affects the supply of capital by creating unemployment, by creating an industrial reserve army, by all sorts of means, including sort of technologically induced unemployment. So that the law of supply and demand is manipulated at that point. It's never in equilibrium, and it can never be in equilibrium, precisely because of the way in which capital distorts it systemically and systematically. There's another place, and this comes up in Volume 2, where demand and supply get into disequilibrium. Marx looks at a very simple model. He says, imagine we have a two-class society. There are capitalists and there are workers. What is the supply and what is the demand in this situation? The demand is given by the demand of capitalists for constant capital plus their demand for variable capital. The supply is constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value. So there's a disequilibrium in supply and demand. Where is the extra demand going to come from to absorb the S, the surplus? Are the workers going to furnish it? No. They can't, obviously. So the only people who can furnish it are the bourgeoisie, which means the bourgeoisie has to actually furnish the demand for the surplus value that's being produced. If it doesn't do it, there will be no demand. So there's a disequilibrium, and in fact, he kind of says, the interesting thing at this point is that the bourgeoisie is intent on increasing that disequilibrium as much as it can by expanding as much as it can the production of surplus value. So the answer is then, okay, the bourgeoisie is going to have to actually cough up and absorb the surplus and pay for it somehow. Well, they can do it through individual consumption, or they can do it by expanding production, by productive consumption, as Marx calls it. They can do it that way. So he basically says, well, actually, the bourgeoisie can do it the day after. But what this means is that it is the activity on the next day which actually absorbs the excess supply on the day before. There's a time gap. How is the time gap covered? Well, what you find in Volume 3, this is what comes when you bring Volume 3 into Volume 2. What you find in Volume 3 is that time gap is covered by the credit system. You do what capitalists always do, which is to buy now and pay later. Now this is a very foundational kind of thing. I like this kind of notion. And what that says, and this is foundational to one of the arguments that comes out of this, is that actually an accumulation of capital is always accompanied by an accumulation of debt. You cannot have one thing without the other. That if there was no accumulation of debt, there will be no accumulation of capital. Capital will come to a halt. Which led me to write a little squiggy piece and send it out and say, well, if the Republicans really have their way in the United States, and they actually stop debt creation, they actually may do a better job at ending capitalism and the working classes in it. And actually this is true. And which is why, you know, all the Keynesians are kind of going ape and kind of saying, gee, you know, we've got to get back and start to create this demand again by, you know, creating more debt, you know. So these relationships start to come out. But this is where the demand and supply thing suddenly goes very wonky in Marx. Now the other element of exchange, which is very crucial, is the element of competition. Again and again and again, Marx talks about the coercive laws of competition. It's the coercive laws of competition that force capitalists to extend the working day more and more and more and more. It's coercive laws of competition that force technological change and relative surplus value. It's the coercive laws of competition that force accumulation for accumulation's sake. It's the coercive laws of competition that actually force you into the general law of capital accumulation. Again and again and again, competition is introduced. Now, the way he sets this up, however, is to say, I don't want to deal with competition here. It is not relevant to the general laws of motion of capital. Why? He says it in the Grundrisse explicitly, but he also says it elsewhere. It's because competition is the enforcer of the general laws of motion, not the determinant. And that then creates, if you like, a way of sidelining the question of competition and monopoly. And now again, this starts to come unstuck at various points. For instance, even in Volume 1, you get the centralisation of capital, the laws of centralisation of capital, and he backs off and says, well, and again, there what he says is that one of the biggest forms of centralisation is, of course, through the finance and credit system, but we're not going to deal with that here. And so this is also going on all the time in Volume 2. We're not going to deal with that here, we're not going to deal with that here. So the coercive laws of competition become terribly important. However, when it gets to Volume 3 of Capital, because in Volume 3 of Capital, when you're considering what happens to credit and finance, Marx suddenly says, it's very interesting, the only thing that regulates the rate of interest is, guess what, supply and demand and competition. The two elements that he's completely ruled out of consideration in everything else. Now maybe it's because he's dealing with a theory of distribution that he felt he could do this, but he then actually starts to reposition what the circuit of money capital is about and the creation of fictitious capital and all that is about. He starts to reposition it and say, this is where the common capital of the class actually finds its own being. And finds its own being also in terms of figures like the Pereira brothers and so on. Now, what I'm trying to suggest here and prove to you here is that Marx takes his syllogistic form of the universal metabolic relation, the general laws of motion of capital, the particularities of production and exchange, and the singularities of consumption, which would normally be dealt with through some sort of notion of utility theory. And what he does is to work in capital solely at the production level, in the generality. So there's a deliberate attempt to do that. Now, he did this, I think, for one very significant and very important reason. But what Marx wanted to do was to generate some, I think, some understandings of, counter-understandings of the laws of motion of capital, which took them out of the particularities of this particular place and time. And I think by sticking at that level of generality, that is the reason we can read him today and still see some connectivity between the essential configurations that he's talking about and the way things are being manifest around us in this particular society, this particular time. And that therefore the generality that he achieved was, I think, a very significant achievement. But it came at a cost. And the cost was an inability to take those general laws of motion and simply plug them in to an existing situation and say, ha, see? No. Because if you want to understand a particular situation, you have to go back to the second set of quotes I gave you from the Grundrisse. That is the way in which everything relates to everything else. And all of these moments are interactive with each other within the totality. And what we have to do is, historically, is to put those elements together. What I find, however, is that Marx, when he was actually looking at the 18th Brumaire and he was looking at class struggles in France, didn't even really make an attempt to do so. Now, when I did the study of Second Empire Paris, I really was stretching between the 18th Brumaire and the class struggles. And I tried to fill in the relationship between what happened in 1848 and what happened in 1871. through a political economic analysis of what was happening to the city and how the city was evolving across all of these dimensions. And that became terribly important to me because it also meant that I had to go back into questions of consumerism. And here we have, in our economies, in the United States in particular, the economy is driven 70% by consumerism. How can you have a general theory of capital accumulation that is not concentrating on consumerism? How can you have a general theory that is not taking into account fictitious capital formation? So there's a big question, I think, that I try to spend time on with my students, which is to say, what is it that Marx can teach us? And what is it that we have to do for ourselves? And I think that's a very important question to ask in reading Marx. Because there's a tendency to say that Marx understood everything. Of course he didn't. He doesn't even try in Capital to understand everything. He just simply tries to actually set out as clearly as he can some general laws of motion of capital, which are always present no matter what capitalism is like. But by separating that generality from particularities of distribution, he opened up a space in which you could make the following kind of argument. That actually, those general laws of motion can fit with all manner of distributional arrangements. That actually Sweden and, say, Pinochet's Chile can coexist. Both, provided they're producing surplus value, can coexist within a capitalist world. In other words, a great deal of divergency can exist within capitalism in terms of distributional arrangements. A great deal of divergence can occur within capitalism in terms of consumer habits and consumerism and cultures of consumption and all the rest of it. A great deal of that variation can occur. So there's tremendous, if you like, possibility that there are the iron laws of motion, if you like, but they are also integrated into a great deal of very specific forms. And if we want to understand our current conjuncture, we just don't go back and kind of look at the general laws of motion. Yeah, we should understand what they're about, and we should understand the dynamics and some of the wonderful things that Marx actually extracted from that. And look at them, but then we also have to do a tremendous amount of work ourselves in terms of saying, well, what is happening to this singularity called consumption? And it's an interesting fact that Marx called this singularity a singularity, which means it's uncontrollable. And it's out of, it's out of economics, it's about human passions, wants, desires. Again, all kinds of regimes of human passions, wants and desires can coexist inside of capitalism and be consistent with the general laws of motion. The big question is, what happens when some of those other elements are not consistent with the general laws of motion? When the production and reproduction of surplus value somehow or other cannot be accomplished because the relation to nature is screwed up, because the distributional arrangements no longer work, because monopoly has set in and monopolistic practices are dominating competition, and how consumerism is working. So, in reading Marx, it seemed to me terribly important to ask that question. What is it that Marx could do for us? And what is it we have to do for ourselves? And I think that what we have to do for ourselves is much more clearly defined once we understand what it is that Marx could do for us. And what his limited engagement was in writing Capital. I'm an intense admirer of that book, obviously. I think it's a fantastic book. And I even think Volume 2 is a fantastic volume when you grapple with its really essential materials and its understandings. But you have to understand its limitations. And so that is, if you like, the foundational message. As we come back, maybe, for people taking Capital more seriously, we don't go back and look and say, on page 85 he told us to do this, or page 95 he said that. No. We try to understand the general dynamics. And then we set to work for ourselves as creative individuals to try to find a solution to this really horrible, horrible mess that we are in and capital is in. And it's a very highly destructive moment. And to me, anyway, it's very important that we learn to use Marx right. Let me leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, David. We've now got a bit of time for questions and comments, and we're going to have a mic or two that are roving to allow people to come in. So can I have an indication of who would like to speak?
You say there's a gap between the political economy and politics. I said there's a gap between that and history, and that's very different. Political economy, Marx's political economy was a deeply political project, no question about it. And it was a revolutionizing of bourgeois political economy in its own terms by exposing its contradictions and its absences. And of course the big absence, and this is, if you like, the critical standpoint from which Marx works, is the sensuality of labour or the historical experience of the working class, whichever you choose. The question of, what I'm trying to draw attention to here is not necessarily Marx's own mode of thinking, but some of the tactical decisions he makes at various points of the text in Capital. At various points in the text, he will, of course, depart from that, and he does, and you can point all of these out, and I'm happy to point them out too. I can come back and cite them to you as well, without any difficulty. By the way, that does include the final kind of question, the whole kind of question of relation to nature. Occasionally Marx does, even in Capital, say something about the relation to nature, and talks about the way in which capital will do an après-moi le deluge approach to both destroying the sources of all wealth, i.e. the labour and the natural world. So yes, there are plenty of examples where Marx actually departs from this, and in fact what makes Volume 1 so particularly engaging is he does that in a fairly freestanding kind of way. What is so annoying and irritating about Volume 2 is he does none of that. And there's hardly any kind of relief, if you like, by kind of going off. Now, I think you're, again, when you kind of say there's some movement from absolute to relative surplus value, I think that's a misreading of Marx. He points out that there's no such thing as relative surplus value without absolute surplus value, and absolute surplus value could not exist if there were not relative surplus value. The whole point of his analysis is to say at the end of the day there's just surplus value, and that is it. And it is precisely turning it into a historical sequence, which is profoundly, I think a profound misreading of what Marx is doing. They are simultaneously present in any capitalistic mode of production, even though there are periods when capitalists will move to one strategy rather than to another strategy. And it is also the case that he frequently does talk about many of these mediating elements that you talk about, but what he does is to indicate that they exist. I mean, this is the typical kind of tactic. I mean, 1 and 2, you get it all the time. He points to something and says, so, this is all going to look different under the credit system. It's not that he ignores the credit system. He says, but we can't deal with that further here. It is not the case, for example, in Volume 1, that he doesn't deal with the fact that you need always to produce new consumption. That you need always to actually have a dynamic process of producing new goods and all the rest of it. So it's not true to say that he didn't say anything about consumption. He does occasionally say there's something to be said about consumption, and the consumption of the working class is indeed the topic that comes in, and it comes in necessarily at certain points of the analysis only when it interferes, as he puts it in here in the Grundrisse, when it becomes clear that he cannot deal with this without actually taking up the question of working class consumption. And there is a deep contradiction in the way which comes out in Marx in Volume 1. Given the dynamics of the kind of model he's created, you see the working class being increasingly eviscerated. In the end of Volume 2, one of the big problems is where the hell is the effective demand going to come from, and part of it is going to come from working class consumption. And so one of the issues that arises at the end of Volume 2 is rational consumption on the part of the working class, which is then introduced into the whole picture as being partly what bourgeois philanthropy and bourgeois concerns are really all about. So this is a very, so yes, there are a lot of moments when these things come in. But what I would want to suggest to you is that actually when you go back and you look at that notion of universality, generality, particularity and singularity, that this is, if you like, a framework within which much of the argument of capital is constructed. And it is the bourgeois framework. And I think that this has some strengths to it, and it also has some weaknesses. And I think that when we clearly understand what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, we will better answer the question, which is one that I think I would really like to leave with you, which is very much this question of what Marx could do for us and what we have to do for ourselves. In terms of teaching Marx, I think that, it just depends where you're coming from. I mean, the idea that everybody should read the Grundrisse before they get into Marx, and then somebody will say, well, actually, you should read Hegel before you read the Grundrisse. And I kind of go, no, don't go in that direction, for God's sake. Maybe it depends, and then maybe you should just read the fantastic emails from people. I mean, a fantastic email from some guy who was older than I am, who kind of said, I live in this little town in Oregon, there's 60,000 people, and I always wanted to read Capital, and I never could do it, and finally I've done it, and he said, it's such a fantastic experience. I wrote about it and he sent me this very exciting piece he wrote in the local newspaper for 60,000 people saying, this is a fantastic time. Goodness, so how to do it, I don't know. I think all kinds of possibilities exist out there. Some people want it this way, some people want it that way, depends on your background, I used to find in teaching it, depending upon which discipline people came from. I mean, I recount in the companion, God, I got into these people who just encountered Derrida and we didn't get out of the first chapter. 8 weeks, drove me nuts. Who is this guy? Somebody should shoot him before he gets too much influence. But actually, I learned from it. I learned a lot from it. I mean, at the time, I was mad as hell, but actually, I did learn a lot from it, I have to confess. And it was very good. So where you start depends upon the baggage you come with, people coming from practical backgrounds, and how to do it. I really don't know the answer to that. I just try to do it the best way I can. One thing I do know, I think, which is very important, is that, we don't try to make Marx more complicated than he really is. And I think that part of the problem with the academicism that has allowed Marx to survive in academia actually over the last 30 years, which was probably the only way it could survive over the last 30 years, that now maybe is a bit of a problem. And all of us who are involved, that's where I was, that's the way I survived, so I'm not criticizing others, I'm saying that's where we were. Maybe we're now at a conjuncture where we should really be taking on this kind of question you're raising, which is how to get people involved in this in a very profound way.
Right, let's see. Sandy, there's someone behind you with his hand up.
Let me start at the end. My own work has been, to a large degree, given over to overcoming that distinction between history and political economy. I mentioned the work on Second Empire Paris, which was an attempt to write a real history of what went on in that city between two revolutionary moments, and to do it in terms that were, I think, largely drawn from Marx's Capital. And I continue to try to do that kind of thing in my writing. So when I write a brief history of neoliberalism, again, there was a lot of theory at work in that. But I really wanted to write the history with a lot of theory in it. And the enigma of capital is a little bit the other way around, but it's a sort of going over the general theory of crises, but with a good deal of history in it. So for me personally, I would say that I would like to see the history theory distinction sort of become redundant. But I have to recognize that in reading Marx, it's really rather stark. I mean, you imagine that these are completely different authors when you're in the middle of volume 2 and you go and read the 18th Brumaire. So I think there is a tradition of making that distinction, and I don't want to clarify the distinction. I want to kind of, in a way, fold it away or merge it or something of that sort, which I think does. There is, and I think this is one of the previous questions. There is a dynamism in Marx's account. I mean, Marx's account is a capitalist process. It's not a thing, it's a process. And what kind of process is it? Well, for instance, it's continuously expanding. It must necessarily expand. And if it expands, how does it expand? Where does it expand into? So actually you can indeed start to see some of the forces which are historical forces. And when I put together that sort of co-evolutionary idea in the enigma of capital, which is to say that there have to be transformations of all these elements, and you look at what neoliberalization was about, how it worked across all of those 7 moments, that it changed the nature of production processes, it changed social relations in a foundational way, and mental conceptions and relation to nature, all of those things changed. And so there is, but you can see why they had to change, and why capitalism is therefore a permanently revolutionary force. So we have those understandings of it, so the understanding of capital is, and the laws of motion are precisely about the laws which guide its necessary aspects of development, as opposed to the contingent and accidental parts of that. And again, that comes back to this question of what is it that, if capital is going to survive, it has to do in order to survive. And you see it's caught in that kind of dilemma right now, what to do. Geographically, it has nowhere, it really hasn't got that much place to go. Geographically, one of the things it's doing is engaging in a huge land grab right now. And what's going on in Africa and what's going on in Latin America with actually grabbing resources is just astonishing. And this is what, and it's individual capitalists. I mean, it's very interesting. In the United States, of course, big universities have big endowments. So you watch what Harvard endowment is doing. What's Harvard endowment doing is buying up large tracts of land in Latin America and Africa, if you can possibly get hold of it. Because I think that actually they're beginning to believe that the only way they can survive ultimately is going to be as rentiers. Actually. And there are some US corporations now, this is why intellectual property rights are so important. That they can survive off the property rights and not even ever produce anything. That this is the kind of the world that a segment of the bourgeoisie is moving towards. But in order to understand that, you've got to understand the significance of rent. And the significance of rent has been much underestimated in the history of the dynamics of capitalism. I pointed out in the Enigma, a little word. It turns out that the bourgeoisie in Britain got far, far richer over land and land development than they ever got out of the factories of Manchester. And I think that the role of land rent has been, very, very much laid to one side. But in order to get to the point where we can merge the theory with the history, you have to have a real good understanding of a lot of these categories that we don't really integrate into the general account that comes from Marx, which is categories like rent. It is categories like the emergence of a financial elite of some kind that has a great deal of significance and power. So to me, what Marx did was to give us a grounding and a foundation to start to explore many of these aspects and do it in a way which is closer and closer to history. On the question of consumerism, this is again one of the paradoxes that actually capital talks about the development of new wants, needs, and desires. How does it do it? Well, one of the ways is it restructures the world in such a way that you have to want things whether you like them or not. For example, it built the American suburbs. Now, one of my arguments is that was one of the big ways in which they got out of the Great Depression. In fact, San Francisco Reserve Bank came up with a nice little quote the other day, which I'm using a piece that's just come out of the Surface Register, and said, what capitalism does when it gets into a crisis is it gets out of it by building houses and filling them with things. And actually, that's what the US has been doing for the last 50 years or more. Actually, it's been doing it since 1945. It's been building the suburbs. And it keeps on building and building and building. And what a surprise! This crisis is a crisis of housing. Oh, what a surprise! And nobody makes the connection. And actually, there is a big, big shift. If you look at the housing production in the United States, in the 1930s it was kind of doing this, and then in 1945 it tripled. And it went like this. And in 2008 it went back down to the 1930s level, i.e. that form of consumption. Now, that form of consumption carries with it certain necessities. Every suburban person has to own a lawnmower. Now, it's human species being dedicated to the idea that somehow or other in their lives they're going to become lawnmower owners. Yay! Out there to go on Sunday and they'll go and everything's going to be, and in other words, yeah, I agree with you that at the moment when consumption of certain necessities is being restricted, the problem is, of course, that it's the necessities that are being restricted, not the goddamn lawnmowers. They're still out there mowing their lawns. And this, by the way, carries with it certain political subjectivities. And it's not as if you have a collective lawnmower down the end of the street, and you kind of figure out who's going to use it when. No, everybody has to have their own lawnmower stuck in their garage. And then you think of this, and you think of the use of resources, the use of land, and the cutting of grass, and all that. Anyway, I won't get into all that. But the point about consumerism is that it is so much structured through the way, and of course you have to have a car, and you have to have a garage, and you have to have, in the end, 3 cars, because your kids can't go anywhere in the suburbs unless when they're 18 years old, they get a car, and if you're lucky, they don't kill themselves, and, So yeah, this is the point, however. One of the things that was missed out, there's no theory of consumerism in Marx, and there should be, if you really want to develop the whole document. One of the things that happened was cultural studies took up the question of consumerism big time and abandoned the political economic background. This was a tragic thing. It kind of says, Marx, they don't understand anything because they haven't understood consumerism, which was a correct decision, a correct criticism. But you don't correct the criticism by abandoning the political economy. And in fact, that's what happened to a lot of cultural studies. So I think the consumerism question is kind of a very, very significant and foundational one, which I would want to spend some time with. And I'm forgetting who's your question. What was it? Yeah. Hegel. Oh God, no! There's a good reason I forgot that. I always remember Joan Robinson saying her objection to Marx was it was like Hegel putting his nose between her and Ricardo. And there are enough books on Hegel for you to go read about the Hegel relation, and there are enough sessions in this conference on the Hegel relation. And I think it's all, very, very important, and I think, I'm sure it's significant. And actually, one of the questions of identity that Marx deals with in here is very important. What a notion of a totality is. I think what Marx is doing here is trying to separate himself off from the conception of totality in Hegel to a rather different view, which is much closer to the sort of Lefebvre's conception of an ensemble, an ecological kind of totality, which is an ensemble of relations. And you can even, if you want to sort of bring in Deleuze or something like that, an assemblage or something like that, Gramsci also used the concept of an ensemble as being the way to understand the totality, which is a non-Hegelian way of understanding a totality. It's more like an ecosystem with many kind of confusing parts, and I'd much rather use that. And I think what Marx is trying to do sometimes is to get himself away from that. I think that there's a clear way, to me anyway, in which some of the Hegelian logic gets into the way in which the argument gets represented in Capital. And I sympathise in the Grundrisse when Marx kind of turns around and kind of, after pages and pages of saying this is related to that and blah, 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 he kind of says this is far too Hegelian, I've got to go back and start all over again. And I kind of sympathise a little with that. But I think, again, from a philosophical standpoint, it's obviously a very important relation. Many people now would also point to Spinoza. And I have all these students who tell me I've got to go read Spinoza, and I kind of go, I'm too old for that. So I just work with what I've got right now. And, sorry, I'm not going to go off and join your reading group on Spinoza. Which, it's very important. I mean, of course, Marx uses Aristotle a lot, and so it's, that's me and Hegel.
Okay, I think we'll take one or two quick questions.
There was a question on the stage.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to this whole kind of issue, but this comes back to what I can do for you and what you have to do for yourself. I think part of the skill of working with Marx is to look for points where you can see some connection between what you're reading and the abstractions that you're grappling with and the realities that go on around you. And when you learn to do that, then that can become a very, very productive way to go. I like to recount that actually, and paradoxically, I wasn't born a Marxist, and I actually turned to Marx rather late in life, comparatively. And one of the reasons was it made sense. And I was involved in this big housing study in Baltimore, and I came across some of these propositions about use value and exchange value. I thought they were really very interesting, and I read Engels on the housing question, and Engels kind of said the bourgeoisie only has one way to solve its housing problem, it moves it around. So I started to use all of that, and I used that in a presentation one time. And first off, I was working with landlords, and they thought this distinction between use value and exchange value was astonishingly interesting. And one of them turned to me and said, I thought you were an economist, And this is really so much more interesting, all these supply and demand curves that you have to look at. And it's a much more interesting way to go. And I thought, well, if a guy is kind of trying to deal with low-income housing in Baltimore and renting housing in the city of Baltimore can see that this makes a lot of sense, and this makes a lot of sense. And I did the same thing with the Canada at a conference, and the vice president of the Chase Manhattan Bank there. And I said, the big problem with housing is the problem keeps getting moved around. And he turned to me and said, it's a fantastic insight. I mean, you know, we've been really trying to improve this neighbourhood in New York, he said. We put all this money into it, and now we find the people who were there no longer living there. He said, he said it was a terrible result, and I really don't understand, but what you're saying is so correct. I thought, well, the Chase Manhattan Bank can get it, it's not obviously really onto something. So the Chase Manhattan guy says to me, he said, yeah, have you written that up? Where'd you get it from? And I thought, well, what shall I say? So in the end I said, well, actually, I got it from Engels. And he says, oh, Engels. Is he the Brookings Institution? So I said, well, no, we should be. But you know, so actually, I came to my Marxism actually through that, actually. I mean, I always was a socialist to a certain point, but Marx made so much more sense. And what you have to do is to find ways to make sense of this in relationship to things going on around you. I mean, things like the distinction between use and exchange value are just very, very simple things that you can actually use around you in, I think, very constructive ways.
Thanks, David. I should all thank David for